On Thanksgiving night, my daughter looked at me across the glowing table and said, "We didn't save you a plate. You should have eaten before you came." The words landed sharper than any knife, and for a moment I thought she was joking. But the laughter around me carried on without pause. Plates clattered, wine poured, and I realized I was the only one left standing, waiting for a chair that did not exist. I had walked in with hope, with the quiet expectation that family meant something unshakable. Yet there I stood, a shadow at the doorway of my own bloodline, invisible in a room I had built with my hands. The table stretched long, heavy with food I could smell, but was not meant to touch. Turkey carved into golden slices, bowls of mashed potatoes crowned with butter, cranberry sauce gleaming under the light. It was abundance overflowing, yet not a fork, not a napkin, not even a corner of the table was left for me. My chair, the one I had always taken at the head, was gone, as though someone had erased me deliberately. I watched my grandchildren giggle, passing bread rolls to one another, never once looking up to see if their grandfather's hands were empty. A son-in-law leaned back in his chair, glancing at me with a smirk that barely bothered to hide itself. "We didn't think you'd be hungry," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. The laughter swelled again, and I felt it pressing against me like a tide, drowning me in humiliation. I had once filled these plates, once carved these turkeys, once made sure no one left this table unsatisfied. Now I was the outsider, a guest not only uninvited, but denied. I shifted my weight, tried to clear my throat, but no one turned. Conversations rolled on as if I weren't standing there. My son raised his glass in a toast I wasn't part of, his voice proud, his smile wide. And I remembered the nights I had worked 2 shifts to keep a roof over his head. That roof was the same one covering this dinner now. But gratitude has a short memory, and betrayal eats quickly when fed with pride. In that moment I understood the cruelty wasn't an accident. It was a statement. The missing chair was more than wood and nails. It was a message carved deep. You don't belong here anymore. My heart tightened, not from hunger, but from the realization that years of sacrifice had been erased with one casual decision. They had food, laughter, and light. I had only the weight of silence pressing down, a silence no one cared to break. I stood there a little longer, letting the sounds of forks and spoons clash in my ears like mockery. No one asked me to sit, no one reached for another plate. I was a stranger in the house that bore my name, in the room I had painted, in the space I had kept alive when bills threatened to swallow it whole. Betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers across a dinner table while you stand, unwelcome, in the doorway. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to you every day. Now, let's continue. The table was a vision of abundance, a banquet overflowing with dishes that shimmered under the warm glow of chandelier light. Platters of turkey steamed, potatoes were whipped into white peaks, bowls of greens gleamed with oil, bread baskets spilled over with golden crusts. Every plate was full, every hand busy passing food from one side to the other, every smile stretched wide in comfort and satisfaction. Except mine. There was no plate waiting for me, no fork placed beside an empty space, not even a napkin folded to suggest my presence was expected. The table had been carefully arranged, deliberately complete without me. I stood in the doorway longer than anyone noticed, and when I finally stepped forward, my eyes swept the spread, searching instinctively for some small token of thought, a chair slightly pulled out, a space made for me, a gesture that whispered, "We remembered you." But the message was the opposite. I was not part of their count, I was not in their number. It was as though, when the meal had been planned, my name had been crossed off the list before the first dish was prepared. The silence surrounding my hunger was suffocating. I could hear laughter, the clink of silverware against porcelain, glasses raised in small private toasts, but none of it reached me. It was noise, not warmth. Noise that reminded me of what I did not have, of what I had been denied. My stomach tightened, but it was not for food. It was for the ache of being excluded, for the bitter knowledge that this had been intentional. I thought of the countless years I had filled these chairs, carving the turkey with steady hands, making sure everyone had seconds before I took my first bite. I remembered working double shifts to pay for these very holidays, saving pennies to make the table heavy with food so no child of mine would ever know hunger. And now, when I stood before the table I had sacrificed to sustain, there was nothing left for me but empty air. Even my absence at the table went unnoticed. No one looked up when I stood still, hands clasped behind my back, eyes moving from face to face. They laughed at private jokes, reached for another serving, wiped their mouths, poured more wine. I was not a father. I was not a grandfather. I was not even a guest. I was invisible. And the cruelest part was how normal it seemed to them, how natural it was to eat without me, to feast while I lingered on the edge of the room like a forgotten shadow. The food on the table no longer smelled like home. It smelled like betrayal, sweet and heavy in the air, pressing down on me with every passing minute. I could almost taste the bitterness of it on my tongue, sharper than hunger, deeper than shame. The room that had once been filled with love now felt like a theater where I had no role to play, where the cast performed without me, leaving me behind the curtain. The table was their world, and I was no longer invited to step into it. A murmur rippled down the table, low enough to pretend secrecy, loud enough to reach me. I caught fragments carried between laughter, careless words tossed like crumbs. He's fine. He eats little anyway. A shrug, a smirk, and the moment passed for them. But for me, it burned into the silence of my hunger. They did not even see it as cruelty, only convenience, as though erasing me from the table was no more significant than forgetting salt in the soup. My presence had been reduced to nothing more than a calculation, and even that calculation declared me unnecessary. I watched their glances dart in my direction, quick and sharp, the way one glances at an intruder who does not belong. Eyes that once ran to me for comfort, for protection, now slid past me, uninterested. A grandchild giggled, but not with me, never with me. It was the laughter of those who knew I was outside the circle, a sound that separated rather than welcomed. The house seemed to lean away from me, every chair filled by bodies that had no space for mine. My own son's face was turned toward others, his smile given freely to them while mine was left starving. Indifference is heavier than hatred. Hatred at least acknowledges you exist, but indifference swallows you whole, erases you quietly while the world keeps moving. They poured wine as if nothing was missing. They clinked glasses as though every soul was accounted for. Only I knew that something greater than a plate was missing. Respect, memory, blood. I could feel the sting of betrayal, not in their words alone, but in the casual ease with which they lived them out. They did not pause when I entered. They did not falter when I stood watching. They did not offer, did not excuse, did not even pretend. To them, I was already gone, a man they had learned to live without. And in that realization, the room grew colder, not because of the air, but because of the walls they had built around their hearts, walls that no longer left me a door to enter. The smirks lingered in my mind like shadows burned into the wall by a flash of lightning. I remembered every hour I had worked to keep this family fed. Every night I came home with aching bones, only to make sure their plates were never empty. And now they mocked me with the cruelest gesture of all, not rage, not insult, but laughter wrapped around my absence. It is one thing to be rejected. It is another to be forgotten in the very place you once held together. The smell of roasted meat and buttered bread should have brought comfort, but instead it dragged me backward through time, into memories that cut sharper than knives. I remembered the years when there was nothing but bills stacked high on the counter, and I worked nights so my children could eat mornings in peace. I remembered skipping meals, pushing my own hunger aside so there would be enough for them, telling myself that a father's duty was to carry the weight no one else could see. Every paycheck went first to groceries, to gas for the stove, to the roof over their heads. Every hour I sweated in silence was another plate I filled at this very table. And yet now, as I stood there with nothing, it was as though none of it had ever happened. The table glowed with abundance, but there was no trace of the hands that had built it. My sacrifices had been devoured by time and by the very people who once depended on them. Not a single glance across the table spoke of recognition. Not a single gesture hinted at gratitude. They had wiped me out of the story of their lives as easily as clearing crumbs from a plate. The cruel irony clawed at me. Those who feasted now did so because I had once gone hungry. Those who laughed did so because I had once swallowed my tears in silence. And yet in their eyes I was just an afterthought, a ghost lingering at the edge of a feast. To them I was no longer the provider, no longer the man who held the foundation of this family together through years of struggle. I was simply extra, unnecessary, the one chair they did not bother to place. It struck me then how fragile sacrifice truly is, when memory decides to erase it. You can pour out your life, shaping every moment to keep others fed, warm, safe. And one day they will act as though you were never there. Betrayal is not always loud. It often sits quietly, disguised in comfort, while you stand outside looking in. And at that table, full of food and faces I once lived for, I finally understood that love given without respect can vanish like smoke, leaving nothing but hunger in its place. I stood there longer than I should have, my hands heavy at my sides, my chest tightening with every second that passed. The hunger in me wasn't only for food, it was for recognition, for the simple acknowledgement that I still mattered at the table I had once built with my own 2 hands. At last, with a voice low and almost ashamed of itself, I asked if a plate could be brought. Just one more place set, not for honor, but for the basic right of belonging. My words barely cut through the laughter, yet when they did, my son-in-law looked up, leaned back in his chair, and smirked with a kind of cruel ease. "We didn't plan for extras," he said, the dismissal wrapped in a tone sharp enough to pierce bone. The room did not fall silent at his words. No one gasped, no one objected. They simply carried on, passing food, pouring wine, raising glasses, while my dignity was struck down in plain sight. It was not just a refusal of a plate. It was the announcement that I was no longer part of them, no longer worth the smallest gesture of inclusion. A lifetime of sacrifice was shattered by a sentence, as if decades of my labor, my sweat, my sleepless nights, had been erased with a flick of his tongue. I felt the heat rise in my chest. Not the heat of anger, but the scorching humiliation of being cast aside in a place where once I had been the center. I remembered carving the turkey year after year, my children waiting eagerly for the first slice from my hands. I remembered the way they used to run to me with laughter, knowing I had made sure this table was never empty. And now I was treated as a stranger who had wandered in by mistake, an inconvenience to be brushed off. There is a kind of pain that does not roar. It hollows you out quietly, like a chisel against stone, cutting piece by piece until you no longer recognize what is left. His words did that to me. They carved deep into my chest, leaving an emptiness where pride had once been. I had endured years of labor, of going without, of pouring myself into the very foundation of this family. But in that moment I realized the truth. Respect can vanish in an instant, and once it does, no amount of history can call it back. I pushed my chair back without a word, though in truth there had been no chair for me to claim. The sound of the legs scraping the floor should have drawn eyes, but it didn't. No one looked up. Forks scraped plates. Glasses touched rims. Laughter filled the air like a curtain closing me out of their world. I rose slowly, my movements deliberate, my silence heavier than any outburst could have been. My body carried years of weight, but my heart carried more. The unbearable recognition that I had finally reached the edge of what I could endure. I did not slam the door. I did not demand justice. I did not remind them of the nights I had gone without food so they could eat, or of the long winters I had kept the heat on while bills threatened to crush me. I did not throw their cruelty back at them. Instead, I let my silence speak, because silence has a way of echoing louder than anger. My footsteps, steady and unhurried, cut through the laughter that continued without pause. Each step was a carving away of something in me, each step a quiet severing of the ties that had already frayed beyond repair. No hand reached to stop me, no voice called after me. I had never felt the truth of abandonment more clearly than in that walk from the table to the door. To them, my leaving was nothing, a minor shift in the room's arrangement, no more significant than someone stepping out for air. But to me, it was the end of a lifetime of devotion, the final thread snapping in a bond I had thought unbreakable. Outside, the air was cold, sharper than the warmth of the house, but in that sharpness there was clarity. The laughter muffled behind the walls only confirmed what I had already understood. I was no longer part of their story, and they no longer deserved to be part of mine. Yet as I walked away into the night, it was not rage that filled me. It was decision. A seed of resolve, planted quietly in the silence, that one day would grow into something far stronger than the cruelty they had shown. The walk home felt heavier than the years that had aged me. Each step pulled with the weight of humiliation, yet beneath the ache of betrayal a quiet fire had begun to smolder. By the time I reached the door of my own house, the one they had just feasted in, my silence had hardened into something unmovable. I entered slowly, the walls greeting me like an old friend that had watched every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every burden I had carried alone. The house knew me, even if they had forgotten. I went to the old oak cabinet in the corner, the one no one else ever opened. My hands trembled, not from weakness but from memory, as I pulled at the drawer that creaked with age. The scent of dust and old paper rose up, carrying with it the echo of decades past. And there it was, resting beneath faded envelopes and forgotten receipts. The deed. The deed to the house that had sheltered every holiday, every meal, every laugh they now shared without me. I lifted it gently, like a fragile piece of truth too powerful to be ignored. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the ink was still bold, unshaken by time. My name stood there alone, carved in black, unquestionable, undeniable. No son-in-law, no daughter, no one else, just me. My signature sealed into the very foundation of the life they enjoyed. My heart tightened as I traced the letters with a finger that had once carried tools, once bled on bricks, once held steady even when my back bent under the weight of survival. That ink was more than ownership. It was proof of a life spent building what they had taken for granted. I thought of how many times I had folded this paper away, never mentioning it, never using it as a weapon, because love had been enough. I had wanted them to feel safe, to know they had a home, never realizing that safety had turned into entitlement, that love had been mistaken for weakness. They had mocked me at the table, forgotten me in the feast, erased me from their circle. But here, in my hands, was the truth they could not erase. The laughter I had left behind seemed distant now, faint compared to the power of the silence that filled the room. The deed was not just paper. It was memory, sacrifice, and justice inked together. And as I folded it carefully and slid it into my jacket, I knew the night was not finished. Their feast had been loud with laughter, but what was coming would be louder in silence. The deed trembled in my hands, not because the paper was fragile, but because of the memories it carried. I smoothed my fingers across its surface, feeling the roughness of age, the slight brittleness at the corners, as though time itself had tried to wear it down. Yet the ink, bold and unbroken, held firm, my name etched there as proof that my life had not been lived in vain. Each letter whispered back the years I had given away piece by piece, the nights when hunger gnawed at me but I kept working, The mornings when exhaustion clung to my bones, but I rose anyway, because a family needed walls, and walls needed hands strong enough to raise them. I remembered the long winter evenings when bills piled higher than the dinner plates, when I quietly pushed my own meal aside so my children would not notice there was less. I remembered the summer days spent on scaffolds, sweat stinging my eyes, my back bent under bricks heavier than my body wanted to carry, but I carried them anyway. Each stone, each nail, each drop of sweat had been a promise that they would never feel what I felt as a boy, that they would know warmth, security, abundance. This house had been more than shelter. It had been a vow written into wood and cement. Now, holding this paper, I felt the cruel irony press into me. They sat laughing at the table within those very walls, blind to the sacrifices that had raised them higher. To them, it was only a house, theirs by assumption, theirs by entitlement, theirs because love had never asked them to question. But to me, this document was blood turned to ink. Every skipped meal, every dollar stretched thin, every calloused handprint was sealed into its weight. It was not greed that made me clutch it closer. It was justice. It was the truth that they had forgotten, the truth they had buried under comfort. They had erased me from the table, but this paper reminded me I had built the table, the floor beneath it, the roof above their heads. Without me, there would be no feast, no laughter, no warmth against the night. And though they had mocked me, though they had pushed me aside, they could not erase what was written here, in my name, on this deed. I sat there in the dim light, the document spread open across my knees, and for the first time that evening I felt no hunger, no shame. What I felt was heavier, deeper, the knowledge that respect, once denied, can return in another form, not with begging, not with shouting, but with the undeniable truth inked on a piece of paper. The night air was cold as I stepped out again, the deed pressed firmly against my chest inside my jacket. Each breath of frost seemed to clear my mind, hardening the silence within me into resolve. My footsteps, once heavy with humiliation, now carried a different weight, a weight not of shame, but of truth. I walked the same path I had taken moments before, but I was not the same man who had left. They thought they had cast me out, reduced me to nothing, but in my hand I carried everything they depended on, everything they had forgotten. The paper was thin, but it trembled with the power of all my years, of every sacrifice turned into black ink, of every burden transformed into ownership. When I reached the house again, laughter still spilled through the windows, warm and bright, as if the cruelty of earlier had never happened. The sound no longer pierced me as it had before. It only reminded me of how blind they were to the ground beneath their feet. I opened the door without hesitation this time, and the warmth of the room rushed over me, carrying the scent of food I had once starved to provide. Conversations faltered for a moment at my return, eyes glancing up with mild surprise, but no welcome. To them, I had left as a ghost and returned as one. But they did not yet know what I carried. I stood at the edge of the table again, their plates full, their glasses raised, their smiles stretched wide, and then I pulled the deed from my jacket and let it rest in my hands where all could see. The yellowed paper caught the light, and silence rolled over the table like a sudden storm. Forks stilled midair, voices died on tongues, laughter collapsed into uneasy quiet. They recognized it even before they could read the words. The power of it was undeniable, for it was not just a document, it was proof. Proof that this house was mine. Proof that their feast, their comfort, their gathering, all of it existed because of me. The deed trembled slightly in my grip, not from fear, but from the weight of everything it carried. I held it high enough for their eyes to follow, and in that moment, the shift in the room was complete. I was no longer the man without a chair. I was no longer the forgotten one standing in the shadows. I was the owner, the builder, the foundation they had ignored but could never erase. They had laughed when they thought I was powerless, but now the truth stood in my hands, louder than any toast they had raised. I stepped closer to the table, the deed firm in my hand, and with a calmness that felt heavier than thunder, I placed it down on the polished wood. The same wood where moments earlier there had been no space for me, no plate, no acknowledgement of my presence. The paper landed with the soft sound of finality, and in that instant the entire room shifted. The laughter that had spilled so easily just seconds before was strangled into silence. Forks hovered above plates, glasses froze halfway to lips, and one by one faces drained of color, as if the truth itself had reached out and struck them cold. The light of the chandelier gleamed across the faded document, making my name stand out bold and unshakable in the ink. They stared at it with wide eyes, each of them reading the unspoken message carved into every letter. This house, this table, these walls, they all bore my mark, my sacrifice, my sweat. The turkey steaming before them, the wine they sipped so freely, the roof above their heads, none of it existed without me. And now the proof lay before them, undeniable, unerasable. Not a word was spoken. The silence pressed down heavier than any scolding could have, heavier than any anger I might have unleashed. Shame has a sound, and it is the sound of nothing at all. I let my eyes move slowly from one face to the next. My son's smirk had vanished, his mouth caught open, his bravado stripped away. My daughter's hands trembled at her napkin, twisting it until it nearly tore. My grandchildren, too young to fully understand, sensed the shift and grew quiet, their laughter withering into confusion. I did not need to speak. The deed spoke louder than I ever could. It shouted the truth they had tried to bury under mockery and indifference. It reminded them that while they had denied me a place at their table, the table itself stood because of me. Every brick in the walls, every nail in the beams, every dollar that kept the doors open, it all carried my name, my years, my sacrifices. And now that truth stared back at them from the paper spread open in the center of their feast. I could see them wanting to look away, but unable to. The silence was a mirror, forcing them to see what they had done, what they had forgotten. Their laughter had died, their pride had withered, and in its place lay only the weight of what they owed, not in money, but in respect, in gratitude, in recognition that could no longer be denied. I let the silence linger until it pressed so heavily against their chests that not one of them dared to breathe too loud. Then, with a voice low and steady, I spoke the words that had been carried in my heart for years. "You eat at my table," I said, my hand resting on the deed, "but it was never yours." The sound was quiet, almost gentle, but it struck harder than any shout could have. Heads dropped instantly, as if the weight of truth had bent their necks against their will. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting anywhere but toward me, toward the paper that bound them to the reality they had tried to ignore. Those who had filled their mouths with laughter now sat with throats dry and tight. Shame does not need volume, it needs only a mirror. And the mirror lay open on the table, my name etched bold across the deed, reminding them that they had not simply forgotten me, they had betrayed the very man whose sacrifice built the walls around them. My son's glass trembled in his hand before he set it down, the wine untouched. My daughter clutched at her napkin until her knuckles whitened, as though fabric could shield her from the truth. Even the younger ones, too innocent to understand the full weight of what I had said, looked around with wide eyes, sensing that something sacred had been broken, something deeper than the absence of a plate. They understood, in the way children do, that the air itself had changed. The humiliation I had carried when I stood hungry and overlooked now passed to them, heavy and undeniable. They tasted it in the bitterness that replaced their food, in the silence that strangled their laughter, in the knowledge that they had feasted while the man who made it all possible had been left standing, unwelcome. They had thought their cruelty was small, a passing slight, but now it revealed itself for what it was, a betrayal written across their faces, illuminated by the truth lying between the dishes. I did not add more words. None were needed. The weight of what I had said filled every corner of the room, and the shame that gripped them was stronger than anything I could force upon them. They were prisoners of their own silence now, each of them facing the truth they could not answer, the truth they could never undo. At last, the silence cracked, not with courage, but with desperation. My son, the same man who had raised his glass in pride only moments before, now set it down with hands that trembled. His mouth opened, but the words caught in his throat like stones too heavy to lift. "Father, he stammered, reaching a hand across the table, as if the simple act of stretching fingers toward me could mend what years of disregard had broken. His eyes were glassy, uncertain, carrying the weight of shame he could no longer hide. But I did not let him touch what he reached for. My hand closed firmly over the deed, pulling it back toward me, pressing it once again to my chest. Respect cannot be begged with half-formed apologies. Dignity cannot be restored by a sudden gesture made only when truth is undeniable. I had given them decades to honor what was right, and in all those years, not once had they thought to remember. Now, with their comfort threatened, he wanted to reach across the divide. It was too late for quick words and hollow regret. His lips fumbled through phrases, fragments of excuses, scraps of explanations, but nothing he said could rise above the memory of his silence while I stood without a plate. Nothing could erase the smirk he had allowed when others dismissed me. Nothing could undo the ease with which he had let me leave the room, unseen, unmissed. A plea spoken in shame cannot erase years of neglect. His stammering only deepened the truth. Respect that is not freely given holds no weight when finally demanded. I saw the fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing me, for he had long taken me for granted, but fear of losing what the deed represented. Fear of a world where the walls he lived within no longer belonged to him by assumption. And in that moment, I felt no satisfaction in his trembling, no victory in his pleading. What I felt was colder, sharper, the realization that sometimes justice comes not in forgiveness, but in the silence that lets a man face the truth of his own actions. I did not answer his plea. I let the quiet stretch, my hand holding the deed steady, my gaze unflinching. He lowered his eyes, his voice dying into nothing, and the weight of his humiliation filled the room where my hunger had once stood. Respect cannot be given at the last moment, when the cost of losing everything becomes clear. It must be earned in the long years, in the small gestures, in the everyday loyalty that builds a bond. And that was something he had not done. Slowly, deliberately, I folded the deed, the crackle of the old paper louder in the silence than any of their voices had been. I pressed the edges together with the same steadiness I once used to mend broken beams, to seal walls against the winter winds. When I slid it back into my pocket, the weight of it settled against my chest, not as a burden, but as a crown. The room seemed to tilt as I straightened my back, and in that quiet motion, everything shifted. I was no longer the man left without a plate. I was no longer the shadow at the door. I was the one who had built the table, the one who owned the ground beneath their feet, the one whose name was carved into the very bones of the house where they sat. The transformation needed no declaration, no raised voice, no demand. It was in the way they looked at me now, eyes lowered, mouths pressed tight, shoulders bent under the truth they could not deny. The laughter that once excluded me had vanished, replaced by a reverence tinged with fear, the recognition of authority they had tried to bury, but that had risen anyway, undeniable. I had not lifted a hand, had not raised my tone, yet the balance of power had turned. They sat with food cooling on their plates, but I held the only thing that mattered, the truth of ownership, of sacrifice, of legacy. My son no longer smirked. My daughter no longer twisted her napkin to shreds. The grandchildren, sensing the change even without understanding, sat still and wide-eyed. The silence was heavy, but this time it was not mine to bear. It was theirs. They carried the shame, the humiliation, the sudden realization that the man they had dismissed still stood taller than all of them combined. I felt no hunger now, no ache of exclusion. What I felt was clarity, a calm that settled into me like stone, reminding me that respect is not taken with noise, it is reclaimed in silence, with truth too strong to ignore. When I turned from the table, it was not as a man cast aside, but as a man who had chosen his place, a man who knew his worth could never be diminished by those who forgot it. They had tried to erase me with an empty chair, but I had answered with something stronger than food or laughter. I had answered with the deed, the proof that while they had denied me a plate, I owned the table itself. I did not raise my voice nor let anger spill from my lips. There was no need. Justice does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes in the quiet weight of truth, laid bare where no one can look away. I stood tall, my hands steady at my sides, and let the silence do what words never could. Around the table, food still steamed, glasses still glistened, but none of them could taste a single bite without tasting the bitterness of shame. Every fork they lifted, every sip they took, now carried my name, the name they had tried to erase, the name that still lived on the deed tucked safely against my heart. They would eat that night, but they would never eat freely again. For the first time they were forced to reckon with the reality they had ignored, that their comfort was built on my sacrifice, their shelter secured by my years, their laughter born from my labor. Every brick in the walls around them, every beam above their heads, every nail in the table they leaned on had been placed there by these hands, hands they had dismissed as unworthy. The silence in the room pressed harder with every passing second, and though I said nothing, I could feel the truth carving into each of them, piece by piece, until they were left hollow with recognition. Justice does not roar, it lingers. It forces the guilty to see themselves reflected in the very things they thought they controlled. They had mocked me, starved me of place, treated me as less than nothing, but now they sat caged by their own shame, bound not by my words, but by the undeniable proof that they had betrayed the man who gave them everything. They had mistaken kindness for weakness, love for silence, but tonight, love had found its voice in the one thing they could not dispute, the deed, the legacy, the truth of who I was. I turned from the table slowly, their faces etched into my memory, not with pride or triumph, but with the deep sorrow of recognition. They would go on eating, but each bite would remind them of me. They would raise their glasses, but in the reflection of the wine they would see the man they had tried to erase. Justice had come, not in fire or fury, but in the knowledge they could never escape. This was my house, my table, my legacy, and though they had denied me a seat, they could never again deny my name. When the candles finally died and the laughter had long since choked into silence, what remained in that house was not the memory of a holiday feast, but the shadow of my steps leaving the room. They did not remember the taste of the turkey, nor the clinking of glasses, nor the shallow jokes they had shared at my expense. They remembered the sound of paper against wood, the deed spread open in front of them like a mirror they could not escape. They remembered the way their own faces drained of color when the truth stood revealed, when my name, written in unshakable ink, reminded them that every bite they had taken was under the shelter of a roof I had built, paid for, and kept alive through years of sacrifice they had chosen to forget. When they cleared the dishes, the table was no longer just wood and polish. It was a witness. It had held their betrayal, their arrogance, their careless cruelty. And then it had held my justice. They had stolen from me a plate, the smallest of gestures, but in their pride they had revealed something far greater, their blindness to the hands that had carried them this far. They thought hunger would humiliate me, but it was their own hearts that starved. They thought exclusion would erase me, but it only carved me deeper into the foundation of the home that could not stand without me. I walked away with the deed, and with it I reclaimed what years of silence had nearly stolen. That paper was more than ownership. It was memory pressed into ink. It was every hour of overtime, every day of exhaustion, every night I went without so they could go with. It was the story they tried to bury at the bottom of their comfort, risen now to the surface where they could no longer ignore it. Betrayal had stripped me of a seat, but justice had given me back the table, the house, the very walls that echoed with my labor. And long after I was gone from the room, they could not eat without thinking of me. They could not walk through the halls without hearing my footsteps, could not sleep beneath the beams without remembering whose hands had raised them. My legacy no longer lived in their fleeting gratitude or their shallow gestures. It lived in stone and timber, in the ink of a deed no one could contest, in the unshakable truth that I had built a life with my bare hands, and they had tried and failed to erase me from it. That night, justice did not roar. It did not punish with fire or vengeance. It settled over them like a weight too heavy to cast off. And in years to come, when my name was spoken in that house, it would not be with pity or dismissal. It would be spoken with the tremor of recognition, the undeniable memory that though they had once denied me a plate, I had claimed the whole table. My legacy was no longer served in food, but written into the very bones of their lives, undeniable, unerasable.